Imagine you're a scuba diver and you're starting one of your earlier dives, or maybe you haven't done a dive in a while. What could happen is you start your dive without air in your BCD, or you just start a dive without air at all. You haven't turned the valve that gives you air. So you jump in, you start sinking, and you have no air to breathe. Situations like this are potentially very dangerous, could lead to drowning, and they're easily preventable by doing a simple safety check. Beans with rice and fish, or BWRAF. This is a type of safety check that is very widely used, highly recommended by things like the Leisure Pro blog or the PADI blog, which is the Professional Association of Diving Instructors. This type of check will make sure that you don't end up in awkward situations when you start your dive. It's so much easier to go through an entire dive without having to worry about some things that come up. So you would want to first check your buoyancy. Your buoyancy is controlled through your buoyancy control device. You will press this button and it will inflate your buoyancy control device. You want to start with lots of air when you first start the dive, because you can change the air once you're already in the water. It's better to start with more than less because of this. The next thing you want to check is your weights. This also helps with your buoyancy. Your weights are either you're using a belt weight or you're using pocket weights like this on the right side and left side. These weights will help you be buoyant in the water. You don't want to either sink or float. You'll know how much weight you need, and if you don't, then it's just kind of a trial and error type of thing. You might end up even using a belt and pocket weights. You just kind of have to figure out what works for you. The next thing you'd want to check is your releases. So normally the BCD is buckled like this. Underneath it would be your belt weight if you have one. These are fairly easy to undo. You need to make sure that you're able to undo it, and you also need to make sure that it's set correctly. The belt weight is pretty easy to mess up. On the right and left side, you would have pocket weights if you do have them. These are fairly easy to take out. You just pull. Sometimes not so easy to take out. They're made so you kind of have to work at it, because they don't want, you don't want them to fall out easily. So these releases are made for really emergencies or before dive prep. During a dive, if you encounter a situation where you're sinking too quickly and you can't control your air, say you completely run out of air and you can't get back to the surface, you would either have to drop your weights using these methods, or you just have to drop the BCD altogether. And this isn't something you really want to do, but I mean, if it's a choice between your gear or your life, you probably want to choose your life. The next thing you'd want to check is your air. So before the dive, you need to check the gauge on the left side to make sure. The gauge is usually right here. You want to have 3,000 PSI. If you have less than that, you probably need to switch out your tank, because once you're at, say, 1,000 or less, you get in a situation where you need to be thinking about ending your dive soon. So if you're starting with less than 3,000, then you're not going to be able to complete a full dive, which is usually, say, 1 to 1.5 hours. 3,000 PSI it'll go up to 2 hours, but you don't want to extend a dive that long. So if you make sure that you have turned the valve on your air tank all the way, you have 3,000 PSI, you have plenty of airflow going through your regulator, then you know your air is working right. The next thing you would want to do is a final check. Say your tank isn't on all the way, maybe your weight belt is loose, maybe you have like a compass or something. Anything that is loose and hanging is a problem. Everything needs to be firmly buckled into your actual BCD, because if you have things that are hanging, they're going to get stuck and you might have to drop all your gear, and this isn't something you want to do. I can't stress enough how important your tank is. Your tank needs to be snug on your BCD. when you get into the water, things will move around differently. So if your tank isn't snug enough, it's gonna move, and then you're gonna have to start your dive over, because you can't really mess with your tank when you already get into the water. So that would be a huge problem. So once you have your final check down, you're ready to dive. So when you don't do this type of check, you couldn't end up in a bad situation like I did a few years ago. So it was really hot, and I wasn't really thinking about double checking anything. I just figured I'd just start my dive early. So I jumped in and I started sinking. I had no air, I had no buoyancy. In emergency situations like this, you might consider dropping your weights or dropping your BCE, or just completely dropping everything as to preserve your life. I was fairly close to the shore, so I was able to get back to shore. But in a situation where you can't get back to shore, you would have to drop everything.